conservation of birds, especially seabirds, has slowly but surely become a greater issue in conservation. This is due to the decrease in bird populations throughout the world. Birds are in general rather picky about where they make their nests. Many birds tend to return to the same areas to nest and breed in. Seabirds are especially known to do this. After migrating large distances, they tend to return to the same areas to nest.
However, with the urban and industrial expansion, the prime nesting sites for a large majority of birds is being transformed into industrial and/or urban settlements. Expansion cannot be stopped. Thus, the major problem for bird conservation is how to retain these nesting sites while still allowing expansion. Some industries have managed to find an equilibrium between bird conservation and expansion. One of these industries is the salt industry.
In Vuldrift, on the west coast of South Africa, there are two main salt producers, Cerebos and Vuldrift Salt Company. Salt companies have various mechanisms by which they increase bird populations. The main one is by creating artificial nesting sites in the forms of islands in the middle of the salt pans. However, these islands are often not large enough to sustain large seabird colonies and can often be disturbed by the salt workers. Thus, the Vuldrift Salt Company has artificial islands especially created to allow seabirds to form large colonies, and when nesting and breeding season is in progress, these islands are left undisturbed.
When mining salt, the NaCl levels or pH are essential. Too high and the salt will not form proper crystals, but too low and the salt will not form at all. However, the optimum level for salt production does not necessarily allow birds to feed or survive in the salt waters, as their food source tends to die out. This leads to many salt pans being devoid of bird life. Therefore, the Vuldrift Salt Company has opted to maintain the pH levels at a lower level to allow the birds to thrive in the salt pans.
Brine shrimp are the main food source for the majority of the seabirds living on the salt pans, but many seabirds travel out to sea to collect fish, jellyfish, and other such marine creatures to feed their young, such as the Caspian terns. These brine shrimp are highly sensitive to pH changes and are moved by water movement. Because the salt pans are essentially non-moving, apart from the occasional wind, these brine shrimp need to be moved throughout the pans by the salt workers.
There are only a few recorded nesting sites for Caspian terns, which are a near-threatened species. The Vuldrift Salt Company has a large breeding colony which returns annually. Other near-threatened bird species which call the Vuldrift Salt Company home, at least for a short time of the year, include the lesser and greater flamingo, the chestnut-banded plover, and the secretary bird.
The saltworks has been built around sustainability for both the continued use of the salt pans themselves as well as the fauna and flora surrounding the saltworks. The flora found around the saltworks constitute parts of the Cape inland salt pan vegetation and the Langebaan dune strandveld. The Langebaan dune strandveld is classified as vulnerable in the National Spatial Biodiversity Assessment.
There are two large canals which have been dug on the property to draw in salt water from the ocean. These brine canals are home to many swallows and swifts which nest in the banks and feed on the swarms of midges. Additionally, the shells removed from these canals are used to make roads on the property. While the salt works have changed the land use of the area from a natural salt pan to an industrial one, the majority of the harvesting is done by hand. This decreases the industrial pressure on the land. The different forms of salt flakes require different amount of time to form, such as fluidicell, which forms within a day and usually seen as small flakes on the surface. The more coarse the salt, i.e. the bigger, the longer it takes to form. The Vuldrift Salt Company has attempted to preserve as many ecological corridors as possible to allow the natural fauna to move through the salt works. There are no recorded frog species, however there are 24 lizard, 18 snake and 1 tortoise species, as well as the 74 bird species and 62 mammals. There are gates set up which lead to the artificial nesting sites which prevent feral and domestic cats from reaching them.
This shows that there are ways to decrease the industrial pressure on the land, and although it does tend to cost more, there are large benefits to finding ways to retain natural wildlife, as illustrated in the quality and productivity of saltwater.